An 8-year-old boy knocks on a neighbor's door on Christmas with a bag of toys. When he explains why, the truth moves the entire street. Snow fell softly over the quiet suburban neighborhood, blanketing roofs and lawns in pristine white. Strings of Christmas lights glowed warmly on every house, their colors casting a gentle shimmer on the icy streets. Amid this festive atmosphere, one house at the corner stood out, not for its decorations, but for its subdued stillness. The holiday cheer seemed to stop just short of its worn front door. Inside, Lucas sat on the living room floor, his legs folded beneath him, and a stuffed bear nestled close to his chest. In front of him lay a large bag filled with toys. Each item carried a story: puzzles, action figures, model cars. But instead of bringing him joy, they weighed heavily on his heart. They weren't just toys anymore. They were reminders of someone who was no longer there. Months had passed since his father had left, yet the absence still hung over the house like a shadow. Christmas had once been the most magical time of year, filled with laughter, baking cookies late into the night, and stories told by the glow of the tree's lights. This year, though, things felt quieter, dimmer. His mother tried her best, but the strain of making ends meet while caring for 2 children showed in her tired eyes. Earlier that day, Lucas had overheard her on the phone. She was speaking in a low voice, but her words carried a heavy sadness. "I just want them to have a good Christmas," she'd said. "They've been through so much already." Her voice stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Sitting alone with a bag of toys, he felt the weight of her worry and his own sorrow. He didn't fully understand all that had changed, but he knew one thing: the toys didn't make him happy anymore. They only reminded him of what was missing. An idea began to form in his mind, hesitant at first but growing stronger with each passing moment. If these toys couldn't bring him joy, maybe they could make someone else happy. Maybe they belonged with another child, one who didn't have toys, or someone who might need them more than he did. He stood, his small hands gripping the top of the bag. The toys were heavier than he'd expected, but he didn't falter. Wrapping himself in his red coat and a scarf his mother had knitted last year, he stepped outside into the cold, pulling the door closed softly behind him. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked down the quiet street, the frosty air nipping at his cheeks. Stopping in front of a house across the road, he took a deep breath. This was where his neighbors lived, a kind couple who often smiled at him and once shared hot cocoa with him after a snowstorm. Their porch light glowed invitingly, but Lucas hesitated. His heart raced. Would they think his idea was strange? Would they even want the toys? Gathering his courage, he knocked. The sound echoed lightly against the frosty silence. A moment later, the door opened, revealing the woman who lived there. She looked at him with surprise and warmth, her smile widening. "Oh, hello there. What brings you out on such a cold night?" Lucas clutched the bag tightly, his voice trembling but steady. I brought these," he began, lifting the bag slightly. "They don't belong to me anymore. I thought maybe someone else could use them." The woman's expression softened. She crouched down to meet his gaze. "Why don't they belong to you anymore, sweetheart?" He shifted uncomfortably, but his words came out clearly. "They were for my dad, but he's gone now. When I see them, it makes me sad. I don't want them to be sad toys. I want them to make someone happy." Her eyes glistened as she gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "Oh," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. The world seemed to pause around him, the quiet night holding its breath as something extraordinary began to unfold. The warmth from the Thompsons' house spilled into the frosty night as Lucas stood on their doorstep, clutching the bag of toys. Mrs. Thompson, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, crouched to his level, waiting for him to continue. Lucas hesitated, shuffling his feet on the snowy doormat. He wasn't used to sharing his feelings, especially not with adults. But there was something about Mrs. Thompson's patient gaze that made him feel safe. "I don't want them anymore," he said again, more quietly this time. Because they remind me of my dad. And that makes me sad." The words hung in the air, fragile but powerful. Mrs. Thompson's heart ached for the boy. She had noticed how quiet his house had been in recent months and had heard whispers from other neighbors about his father's absence. Still, hearing Lucas articulate his pain so simply and honestly left her at a loss for words. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Thompson reached out and gently touched Lucas's shoulder. "You're very brave to share this, Lucas," she said softly, "and so kind of want to give these toys to others." Her words brought a small, shy smile to his face. Before she could say more, Mr. Thompson appeared at the door, holding a mug of coffee. "Who's there, Hal?" "Hey there, Lucas," he said with a surprised but friendly grin. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Thompson quickly filled him in, her voice low and filled with admiration. As Mr. Thompson listened, his expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a mix of sorrow and respect for the boy's selflessness. "Well, Lucas," Mr. Thompson said, crouching beside his wife, "you're doing something really special here. Do you know anyone who could use these toys, or should we help you find the right kids?" Lucas looked down at the bag and thought for a moment. Maybe kids who don't have toys. Like the ones I saw on the news," he said, remembering a story his teacher had shown the class about children in shelters during the holidays. Mrs. Thompson's heart swelled. "That's a wonderful idea, Lucas. You know what? Let's do this together. We can ask some of the neighbors if they'd like to help too. What do you think?" Lucas's eyes widened. He hadn't expected such an offer. "Really?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Really," she replied with a warm smile. "I bet there are lots of people around here who would love to join in." "You started something beautiful, Lucas." The Thompsons invited him inside to warm up for a bit. They set his bag of toys on the kitchen table and began discussing plans. Lucas sat quietly as Mrs. Thompson pulled out a notepad and began jotting ideas. Mr. Thompson suggested turning it into a neighborhood toy drive, one that could make a difference for many families. Lucas felt a strange mixture of pride and nervousness. He had only wanted to find a way to let go of his sadness, but now it seemed like his decision could ripple out, touching more lives than he had imagined. That night, as Lucas walked back home, his cheeks pink from both the cold and the unexpected kindness he had received, he felt lighter. The bag of toys was no longer a weight on his heart. It was now a part of something much bigger. The Thompsons stayed up late, drafting flyers and making calls to neighbors. By the time Lucas went to bed, the first seeds of the toy drive had already been planted. What began as a single knock on a door was about to grow into a movement. The next morning, Lucas woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of his little sister humming Christmas carols in the kitchen. For a moment, the warmth of the scene made him forget about the night before, but then the memory of the Thompsons' kindness and their plans for the toy drive filled him with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. When Lucas stepped outside to shovel the light dusting of snow from the walkway, he noticed something different, a bright red flyer taped to the lamppost near his house. Curious, he walked closer. The words, "Community Toy Drive, Bring Joy This Christmas," stood out in bold, cheerful letters. Below, it explained the effort to collect toys for children in need, inspired by a young neighbor's generosity. His heart skipped a beat. That young neighbor was him. Lucas scanned the street and saw Mrs. Thompson waving from her porch. "Good morning, Lucas," she called, walking over to him. "What do you think? We stayed up late making those flyers and putting them around the neighborhood." Lucas looked down, shyly kicking at the snow. "I didn't think it'd be a big deal," he murmured. Mrs. Thompson crouched to meet his gaze. "It's a big deal to a lot of people, Lucas. You started something beautiful, and now we all get to help make it even bigger." Throughout the day, the Thompsons' phone rang nonstop. Neighbors who had seen the flyers wanted to know how they could help. Some offered toys their children no longer played with. Others promised to buy new ones. A few even volunteered to donate time to sort and wrap the gifts. Lucas joined the Thompsons in their living room, which quickly became the unofficial headquarters of the toy drive. Boxes and bags of donations began to pile up, and Lucas watched in awe as neighbors he'd only seen in passing arrived with smiles and words of encouragement. One of the first contributors was Mr. Rivera, a retired teacher who lived alone at the end of the street. He brought a stack of storybooks, carefully wrapped in festive paper. "I've been saving these," he said with a warm smile. "I always hoped they'd go to kids who'd love them as much as my students did." Another neighbor, Mrs. Chen, arrived with an enormous bag of stuffed animals. "My kids have outgrown these," she explained, patting Lucas on the shoulder. "Thank you for reminding us to give back." But not everyone was immediately on board. Lucas overheard one of the neighbors, Mr. Harris, muttering as he dropped off a single small toy. "Doesn't feel like much of a Christmas for us if we're just giving things away," he said under his breath. Lucas's cheeks burned, but before he could say anything, Mrs. Thompson stepped in, her voice steady. "Sometimes the best part of Christmas is what we can give, not what we get," she said kindly. Lucas took those words to heart. As the day went on, the piles of toys grew, and so did Lucas's confidence. Helping sort the toys and hearing the stories behind each donation made him feel a connection to his neighbors he'd never felt before. Even the smallest contributions carried a kind of magic. Each item was chosen with care, meant to bring joy to a child who needed it. The first big milestone came that evening, when Mr. Thompson announced they had enough toys to fill 3 donation boxes. "We'll take the first batch to the shelter tomorrow," he said, clapping Lucas on the back. "And there's still time to collect more." For the first time in months, Lucas felt something stir in his chest, hope. Not just for himself, but for what his small idea had become. That night, he sat by the window in his room, watching the snow fall softly under the glow of the streetlights. He thought about his father and the memories tied to those toys. They no longer felt like a weight. Instead, they had become part of something larger, a gift that carried his sadness away and replaced it with something much brighter. The following morning was crisp and bright, the snow glittering under the pale winter sun. Lucas stood in the Thompsons' porch, bundled in his red coat and scarf, watching his neighbors arrive with the final donations for the first batch of toys. The living room was now a sea of boxes wrapped in cheerful paper, each brimming with stuffed animals, books, puzzles, and action figures. Mr. Thompson, clipboard in hand, directed the effort. "We've got 3 cars ready to go," he announced. "We'll take these to the shelter downtown. They're expecting us by noon." Lucas felt a flutter of nervousness as he helped carry a box to one of the cars. He wasn't sure what to expect at the shelter, what the children would be like, or how they'd react to the toys. Part of him still couldn't believe this was all happening because of him. Mrs. Thompson noticed his quietness and knelt beside him. "You okay, Lucas?" she asked gently. He nodded, but his voice was hesitant. What if the kids don't like the toys? What if it's not enough?" She smiled warmly. "Oh, Lucas, these toys are more than enough. But what's really special is that they're coming from the heart. That's what makes them a true gift." Lucas held on to her words as they loaded the last box into the car. He rode with the Thompsons to the shelter, sitting quietly in the back seat as the city blurred past the frosted windows. When they arrived, the shelter was already bustling with activity. Volunteers in Santa hats greeted them at the entrance, their faces lighting up when they saw the cars full of donations. Inside, a room had been set up like a festive wonderland, with garlands, a tree, and tables laden with treats. As Lucas helped carry the boxes inside, he noticed the children, some younger than him, some older, gathered in small groups. They wore mismatched clothes and looked at the scene with wide eyes, as though they weren't quite sure what to make of it. A volunteer approached the group, clapping her hands. "Okay, everyone. It's time to see what's in those boxes," she said, her voice cheerful. The children moved hesitantly at first, but as the boxes were opened, the room came alive with laughter and excitement. A little girl with pigtails squealed with delight as she hugged a stuffed rabbit. A boy with bright eyes grinned as he flipped through the pages of a picture book. Lucas stood back, watching it all unfold, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and pride. Then something unexpected happened. A boy about Lucas's age walked over to him, holding a toy truck. "Did you bring this?" the boy asked. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, kind of. It was mine." The boy studied the truck, then looked back at Lucas. "Thanks," he said simply. "I've never had one like this before." Lucas felt a lump in his throat. He had thought letting go of his toys would be hard, but seeing the joy they brought to someone else made it all worth it. "You're welcome," he managed to say. As they packed up to leave, the shelter's coordinator approached the Thompsons and Lucas. "This was an incredible gesture," she said. "You've made so many children happy today. And, sometimes it's not just about the toys, it's about showing them that people care." On the drive home, Lucas stared out the window, lost in thought. The boy's gratitude and the coordinator's words stayed with him, weaving themselves into the deeper meaning of what the toy drive had become. When they returned to the neighborhood, Lucas helped unload the cars and prepare for the next phase of the project. There were still more toys to collect and more families to help, but for the first time, Lucas felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The first delivery had been a success, and it was only the beginning. The toy drive quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. Over the next few days, more people came forward to contribute, their generosity transforming the Thompsons' living room into a bustling hub of activity. What had started with a single bag of toys now involved nearly every family on the street. Lucas worked tirelessly alongside the Thompsons, sorting through the growing mountain of donations. Each toy told its own story. Some were brand new, carefully chosen at the store, while others came with handwritten notes from children who wanted to pass on their favorites to someone who needed them more. As word spread beyond the neighborhood, local businesses began to join in. The corner coffee shop set up a collection bin, and the grocery store offered a discount to customers who donated toys. Even the fire station contributed, with firefighters delivering a box of toy fire trucks and coloring books. The excitement was contagious, but with the growing success came new challenges. The Thompsons' home, already packed with donations, began to overflow. Volunteers arrived to help, but the sheer volume of toys required careful planning to ensure every gift reached the right place. One snowy afternoon, Lucas stood in the middle of the Thompsons' crowded living room, staring at the pile of toys and feeling overwhelmed. "How are we going to make sure all of this gets to the right kids?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Lucas. It's a lot, but that just shows how many people care. And you're the reason it all started." Lucas nodded, but the weight of responsibility still pressed on him. As much as he was inspired by the outpouring of support, he couldn't shake the fear that something might go wrong, that they might miss a family in need or fail to meet someone's expectations. Later that evening, the neighborhood held a meeting at the community center to discuss the next steps. Lucas sat quietly in the back as adults debated logistics, how to divide the toys, where to deliver them, and how to identify families who might need help. Finally, Mr. Thompson stood up and cleared his throat. "This all started because of Lucas," he said, gesturing toward him. "I think we should hear what he has to say about where these toys should go." All eyes turned to Lucas. He hesitated, his cheeks flushing under the sudden attention. But then he thought about the boy at the shelter, clutching the toy truck and smiling as though it were the best gift he'd ever received. I think we should give them to places like the shelter," Lucas said, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "But also to families who might not ask for help but still need it. Sometimes people don't say anything, even if they're struggling." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Lucas felt a surge of relief. His suggestion had been heard, and it felt like he was truly part of the effort, not just as its spark but as its heart. By the end of the meeting, the neighborhood had a plan. Volunteers would deliver toys to shelters, hospitals, and community centers, as well as discreetly drop off gifts to families identified by local schools and churches. The next morning, Lucas woke to the sound of car engines revving outside. Peering out his window, he saw a convoy of vehicles lined up, each one packed to the brim with brightly wrapped boxes. The neighborhood had come alive with purpose, and the air buzzed with a sense of shared excitement and accomplishment. As Lucas helped load the last of the toys, he noticed a group of kids from the street gathering near the Thompsons' porch. Some of them were older, some younger, but all of them had come to help. For the first time, Lucas felt truly connected to his neighbors in a way he hadn't before. The deliveries would soon begin, and with them, the toy drive's impact would stretch far beyond their quiet little street. Lucas couldn't wait to see what happened next. The neighborhood toy drive had grown into something bigger than Lucas could have imagined. That morning, as the first deliveries rolled out, Lucas was invited to join one of the teams heading to a nearby children's hospital. The drive there felt different from the trip to the shelter. The weight of the boxes in the back of the car wasn't just about toys. It was about the hope they carried. Lucas sat quietly in the back seat, watching the city pass by. When they arrived, a nurse with a kind smile greeted them at the hospital entrance. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, motioning toward the lobby. "The kids are going to love this." Lucas helped unload the boxes, his small hands gripping the edges as he carried them inside. The hospital's pediatric wing had been transformed into a cheerful holiday haven, with paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling and a brightly lit Christmas tree standing tall in the corner. The children were already gathered, their faces lighting up as the gifts were placed in front of them. Some were in wheelchairs, others hooked up to IVs, but for those moments, their excitement outshone everything else. Lucas stood back, watching as the kids opened their gifts. One little girl with a bandage on her arm clutched a stuffed bear to her chest, her eyes wide with joy. Another boy, who couldn't be older than 6, carefully unwrapped a set of building blocks, his grin growing wider with each piece he pulled from the box. Lucas felt a tug at his sleeve. Turning, he saw a nurse kneeling beside him. "Would you like to hand out a toy?" she asked, holding out a wrapped present. His heart raced as he nodded. Taking the gift, he walked over to a boy about his age who was sitting quietly at the edge of the group. The boy looked up, his eyes cautious but curious. "This is for you," Lucas said, holding out the gift. The boy hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing against the wrapping paper. "Thanks," he said softly. Lucas watched as the boy carefully opened the present, revealing a set of superhero action figures. A small smile crept across his face. "Do you like superheroes?" Lucas asked. The boy nodded. "Yeah, they make me feel brave." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. "Me too," he said. As the boy started to play with his new toys, Lucas realized something he hadn't fully understood before. The toy drive wasn't just about giving things, it was about creating moments like this. Moments where joy replaced sadness, where hope found its way into hearts that needed it most. When the last gift had been handed out, the hospital staff gathered the volunteers for a group photo in front of the tree. Lucas stood in the middle, holding a candy cane one of the nurses had given him, and smiled as the camera clicked. On the way back home, Lucas stared out the car window, his thoughts swirling. For so long, he carried the weight of his father's absence, feeling like it had taken something from him that he couldn't get back. But today, he felt lighter. By sharing his toys and his story, he had found a way to transform his sadness into something meaningful. When they pulled into the neighborhood, Lucas saw the Thompsons standing on their porch, waving as the car approached. The other volunteers were busy preparing the next round of deliveries, their energy undimmed by the day's efforts. Lucas stepped out of the car, his cheeks pink from the cold. Mr. Thompson walked over, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "You did good today, Lucas," he said with a warm smile. "You've done something really special." Lucas didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, feeling a sense of pride he couldn't put into words. As the sun set and the neighborhood lights began to twinkle, Lucas sat by his window at home, staring out at the snow-covered street. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The toy drive had become more than Lucas ever expected. By the evening, the neighborhood was buzzing with stories of their deliveries, children laughing at the shelters, families smiling with relief, and volunteers returning with a glow of accomplishment. Lucas felt a sense of pride, but there was still a small ache in his heart. As he sat at the Thompsons' kitchen table, helping sort through the last few donations, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Thompson went to answer, her warm voice greeting the visitor. A moment later, she returned with a man holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was bundled in a heavy coat, his scarf tucked around his neck. "I heard about the toy drive," the man said, his voice hesitant but kind. "I wanted to contribute." Lucas glanced up from his task and froze. There was something familiar about the man, the way he carried himself, the way he avoided eye contact but kept a soft smile on his face. Mrs. Thompson gestured for the man to set the box down. "Thank you. We've had so many generous donations. It's amazing how much everyone wants to help." The man nodded, then turned to Lucas. "You must be the boy everyone's been talking about," he said, his voice quiet. "The one who started all of this." Lucas's cheeks flushed. I guess," he murmured. The man smiled faintly. "It takes a lot of courage to do what you've done. Turning something hard into something good. It's not easy." Lucas didn't know how to respond. There was a strange feeling rising in his chest, a mix of curiosity and unease. Before he could say anything, Mrs. Thompson spoke up. "Do you live nearby? I don't think we've met before." The man hesitated, looking down at his hands. "I don't live here anymore," he said finally. "But I used to. I came back because I heard about the toy drive and thought it was something I could help with." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. "Used to live here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man met his eyes, and for the first time, Lucas saw the recognition there. "Yeah," the man said. "A long time ago." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with unspoken words. Mrs. Thompson looked between Lucas and the man, her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing. "Thank you for helping," Lucas said finally, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. The man smiled again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, thank you," he said. "What you're doing here, it's something to be proud of." After he left, Lucas sat quietly, staring at the box the man had brought. He wanted to ask Mrs. Thompson if she knew who the man was, but something held him back. Deep down, he thought he already knew. When Lucas got home that night, his mother was waiting for him. She smiled as he walked in, her eyes tired but warm. "You've been busy today," she said, pulling him into a hug. "Yeah," Lucas replied, his voice distant. She studied him for a moment. "Is everything okay?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." That night, as Lucas lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the man. Whether or not he would come back, whether or not they would speak again, Lucas didn't know. But what he did know was this. The toy drive had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection not just to his neighbors, but to something bigger than himself. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall, covering the neighborhood in a pristine white blanket. The toy drive was winding down, the last few deliveries scheduled for the morning. Lucas stood outside the Thompsons' house, watching as the remaining boxes were loaded into cars. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, but now with the work nearly done, Lucas felt a calm he hadn't experienced in a long time. He thought back to the beginning, to the bag of toys he had carried across the street, and marveled at how it had grown into something so much bigger. As he helped tie a final ribbon around a large gift box, Mrs. Thompson called out to him, "Lucas, can you come inside for a moment?" He followed her into the living room, where a small group of neighbors had gathered, their faces glowing with warmth. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, holding a small wrapped gift. "We wanted to thank you, Lucas," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "None of this would have happened without you." Lucas blinked in surprise. "But I didn't do it alone," he said, looking around at the smiling faces. "No," Mrs. Thompson agreed, "but it started with you. And your kindness inspired all of us." Lucas took the gift, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't need anything," he said softly. "This isn't just a present," Mr. Thompson said, smiling. "It's a reminder of what you've given to everyone here, a chance to remember what Christmas is really about." Lucas unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a simple wooden ornament shaped like a heart. Etched into the wood were the words, "Kindness changes everything." His throat tightened, and he looked up at the group, unable to find the words to express how he felt. Later that evening, Lucas returned home, the ornament clutched tightly in his hand. His mother and sister were waiting for him, their small tree glowing softly in the corner of the living room. His mother knelt beside him, brushing the snow from his coat. "I'm proud of you, Lucas," she said, her voice full of emotion. Lucas looked at her, the weight of the past few weeks suddenly catching up with him. "I miss him," he whispered. "I know," his mother said, pulling him into a hug. "I do too. But your father would be so proud of what you've done." As they sat together, Lucas felt the ache in his heart begin to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. The next morning, Christmas Day, the neighborhood came alive with the sound of laughter and celebration. Children raced through the snow with their new toys, and families gathered on porches to exchange holiday greetings. Lucas spent the morning with his sister, helping her unwrap her presents and building a small snowman in the front yard. As the sun began to set, Lucas saw the man from the other night standing at the edge of the street. He wasn't carrying a box this time, just standing quietly, watching the neighborhood bustle with joy. Lucas walked over, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The man looked down at him, his expression soft. "You came back," Lucas said, his voice steady. "I wanted to see how it all turned out," the man replied. Lucas hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind since their first meeting. "Are you going to stay?" The man's eyes flickered with emotion, but he didn't answer right away. "I'm not sure," he said finally, "but I'd like to try." Lucas nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay." As they stood together, the snow falling softly around them, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Christmas wasn't just about the presents or the decorations. It was about the connections they had made, the kindness they had shared, and the love that had brought them all together. And as Lucas walked back to his family, the ornament in his pocket, he knew this Christmas was one he would never forget.